Mom kicked me out because my stepdad and his kids hate me, but I own the house. When I was 15, my dad passed away. It was a tough time. Losing him felt like my whole world got flipped upside down. My dad, though, was always that guy who had everything planned out, you know? Super organized. The kind of guy who'd keep receipts for stuff from 10 years ago just in case. Anyway, turns out he had his will all set up way in advance, and let me tell you, it was specific as hell. After he passed, my mom didn't waste any time moving on. I get it. Maybe she was lonely, but it felt way too quick. One moment we're at his funeral, and before I even had a chance to process everything, she's already talking about some new guy she met. And I'm like, wait, what? It felt like 1 minute I was dealing with losing my dad, and the next, there was this stranger, Rob, moving into our house. It all happened so fast, I barely had time to blink. One day it was just me and my mom trying to get by, and the next, there's this dude in our living room acting like he's been there all along. Rob was, well, I guess he was all right at first, but man, it just didn't sit right with me. I mean, my dad's stuff was still all over the place. His chair, his tools, even his favorite mug that he'd always use every morning. It was like he was still there. And then Rob comes in, and suddenly all that stuff starts disappearing. My mom would be like, oh, we need to make room for Rob's things. And I'd think, what's the rush? It's not like Rob was paying rent or anything. It felt like she was erasing my dad bit by bit, and that stung. A couple of months after my dad passed, I got the news about the inheritance. I remember the day so clearly because it was probably the one time I actually felt like something was going right. My dad's lawyer sat me down and explained everything. My dad left everything to me, not a penny to my mom. I guess it makes sense since they weren't married and legally she didn't have a claim, but still it caught me off guard. At first I was like, wait, are you serious? I didn't really know how to react. I mean, I was just a kid, and suddenly I was told I owned properties and money. It was kind of overwhelming. My mom, though, oh, she was pissed. She tried to act all supportive, but I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't expecting that. She probably assumed she'd get at least something. But nope, it was all mine. And because of the way my dad set up the will, there was no way she could challenge it. The guy was thorough. He made sure everything was locked down so tight that even if she tried, she'd lose. At first, she tried to play nice, like, hey, I'm so happy for you, sweetheart. Your dad loved you. But it wasn't long before she started pushing. She kept bringing up how it would be nice if I shared some of it with her, as a gesture of goodwill or whatever. It was always framed like it was my choice, but the way she said it, it felt more like pressure. Then one day she comes up with this plan. She asked me if I'd consider transferring one of the properties to her. I remember standing there, just kind of staring at her like, is she for real? She went on, saying how it would make things easier with Rob if he felt secure, like he was really part of the family. She wanted to show him that he was welcome by putting the property in her name. In her head, this was all about making him feel comfortable so they could have a future together. But to me, it felt like she was choosing him over me. I mean, I was 15. I just lost my dad. I was still trying to figure out how to get through each day. And here she was, basically asking me to give up a piece of my dad's legacy to make her new boyfriend happy. It was like she didn't even think about how it might feel for me, her own kid. I told her I couldn't even if I wanted to. My dad's will was set up so that I couldn't touch any of it until I was 21. The look on her face when I said that, man, I don't think I'll ever forget it. She tried to hide it, but she was mad. I think she knew deep down that she couldn't change anything, but it didn't stop her from trying. She'd bring it up every once in a while, just testing the waters like, are you sure you can't transfer it? Not even one property? And every time, I had to remind her that there was literally nothing I could do. It wasn't my choice. It was how my dad set things up. To be honest, even if I could have given her the property, I don't think I would have. It felt like a betrayal to my dad's memory. This was his way of taking care of me, making sure I had a future, and I wasn't going to mess that up just to make my mom's new boyfriend feel cozy. And of course, there were Rob's kids. My mom was bending over backward to make sure they felt welcome. They were cool, I guess. A son who's now 18 and a daughter who's 19. But my mom was all about making them comfortable, making sure they had everything they needed. It wasn't like she was a total monster to me or anything. She still acted like a mom. But there was this clear difference in how she treated them compared to me. I'd see them all go on trips together. She'd always frame it like it was this great idea, saying, wouldn't you rather visit your grandparents on your dad's side? Like, every single time they planned something, she'd suggest I spend time elsewhere. I could see right through it. She didn't outright say you can't come, but it was obvious she didn't want me around. And when you're a kid, you don't really know how to react to that. You just kind of go along with it, hoping that maybe she'd change her mind. But she never did. I spent a lot of weekends at my grandparents' place. And don't get me wrong, they were great. But every time I heard about one of those trips, it was like a little reminder that my mom was choosing her new life over me. Looking back, I think my dad must have known something like this could happen. Why else would he leave everything to me and nothing to her? Maybe he saw how things were going between them, or maybe he just wanted to make sure I'd be okay if anything ever happened to him. Either way, I'm grateful he did, but at the same time, it made things with my mom really complicated. I felt like I was stuck in the middle, having to protect what my dad left me while also dealing with my mom and her new family. That's pretty much how things went for a while. Rob settled in more and more, and my mom made sure his kids felt like they were at home. And me? Well, I kept my distance and just tried to keep the peace. But it wasn't easy. I was only 15, trying to make sense of everything, and all I knew was that things were never going back to how they used to be. By the time I turned 17, things had gone from awkward to full-blown tense between me and Rob. I mean, I tried to stay out of his way at first, like he was my mom's boyfriend, whatever, I didn't really care about him. But he started acting like he was the man of the house, and that's when things went south. It was my dad's house, right? And here he was, moving his stuff in, giving me attitude, and trying to tell me what I could or couldn't do. It wasn't even subtle. He'd say stuff like, "You need to show more respect around here," or "It's time you learn some discipline." I just sat there thinking, who does this guy think he is? Like, he's not my dad, and he sure as hell doesn't get to act like he owns the place. So I pushed back. Every time he tried to lay down some rule or act like he had a say, I'd remind him that the house wasn't his. I even came up with this nickname, John Conroy, which honestly made no sense, but it bugged him, and that was enough for me. Every time he tried to tell me what to do, I'd be like, "All right, John Conroy, whatever you say." And man, did that get under his skin. Things started getting pretty heated between us. It was like this silent war. He'd make these comments, and I'd snap back. My mom, of course, was always trying to play peacemaker. She'd say, "Oh, you two just need time to get used to each other," or "Rob's only trying to help you grow up." But I knew it wasn't about that. It was about control. Rob wanted to be the boss, and I wasn't about to let that happen. And the thing is, my mom started taking his side more and more. She'd get upset with me for disrespecting him. She even started saying stuff like, "You need to understand that Rob's a part of our family now." Our family, as if we'd all agreed on that or something. I'd tell her, this isn't his house, it's Dad's, and he's not going to just waltz in and act like it's his. But she never listened. She just kept telling me to get along and try harder. One day, things really blew up. Rob had been acting all tough, talking about how I needed to pull my weight around the house, and yeah, that pissed me off. I told him straight up, "You're not my dad, and this isn't your house." He started getting all red-faced, and my mom came rushing in, trying to calm things down. She was like, "Why do you always have to fight with him? Why can't you just respect him?" And I was like, "Why should I? He doesn't respect me, and he doesn't respect that this was Dad's house." That argument was kind of the last straw. Rob stormed off, and my mom just stood there looking tired and frustrated. She said something like, "This isn't working. We can't keep fighting like this." And that's when she dropped the bomb on me. She told me I needed to leave. I couldn't believe it. I stood there waiting for her to take it back or say she was just upset and didn't mean it, but she didn't. She looked me in the eye and said, "I think it's best if you find somewhere else to stay for a while." I was like, "Wait, my house? You're kicking me out of my house?" She just sighed and said, "It's not just your house, it's our home, and Rob and his kids deserve to feel comfortable here too." I felt this wave of anger and hurt hit me all at once. She was choosing them over me. It wasn't even a question anymore. She kept going, saying, "I'm doing this for your own good, so you can have some space and cool down." But I knew it wasn't about me cooling down. It was about making things easier for her and Rob. She thought if I wasn't around, they'd have their perfect little family, and everything would be fine. I left the room, slamming the door behind me. I was so mad I could barely think straight. I didn't even know what to do next. I mean, I was 17. I didn't have a job that paid enough to get my own place, and all my stuff was in my house. I went up to my room and started packing up my things, just throwing stuff into bags. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there anymore. Thankfully, my grandparents stepped in. They'd always been there for me, even when my mom wasn't. They offered me a place to stay, and I grabbed onto that offer like a lifeline. My grandpa picked me up that evening, and I remember just sitting in the car, staring out the window, feeling numb. It was like everything had crumbled in one day. My own mom was kicking me out of the house my dad had left me. When I moved into my grandparents' place, it felt safe. They were amazing, and they never made me feel like I was a burden. My grandpa especially tried to make me feel better. He said, "You're always welcome here, kiddo. Don't let anyone make you think otherwise." And honestly, I needed to hear that. After everything with my mom, it felt good to know someone had my back. But my mom, she'd still come over to visit sometimes, acting like everything was fine. She'd say things like, "I love you, you know that, right? And I'm just trying to make sure everything stays peaceful." It was like she was trying to make herself feel better about what she'd done. I remember one time, she brought over a bunch of my old things, saying she thought I'd want them at my grandparents' place. And I just stared at her thinking, you want to act like this is normal, but it's not. She'd talk about how she was just doing what was best for everyone, how Rob needed space to feel at home, and how I'd understand one day. I just nodded along, but inside, I felt like she was justifying her own choices. She'd say stuff like, "You'll always have a home with us when you're ready." And it took everything in me not to tell her that it wasn't my home anymore. It was Rob's. It was hard to see her and not feel angry. She was the one person who was supposed to be on my side, and she wasn't. She was choosing some guy she'd known for barely a couple of years over me, her own son. And she acted like it was all for my benefit, like kicking me out was somehow her way of helping me grow up. After a while, I just stopped engaging with her visits. I'd be polite, but I wouldn't let her excuses get to me anymore. I focused on my school, my friends, and my grandparents. They became my real family during that time. My grandma would always tell me, "You've got us, and you're going to be okay." And even though I still felt angry and hurt, having them around made things a little easier. I guess deep down, I started to understand that my mom was never going to be the parent I needed her to be. She was too focused on building this new life with Rob and his kids. And me, I was just a reminder of the old life she was trying to move past. So I started moving past it too. I figured if she could pick Rob over me, then I could choose to focus on myself instead. At the end of the day, I knew I had my grandparents' support, and that was enough. I learned to stand on my own 2 feet, even if it meant not having my mom there. And honestly, that was probably the best lesson I could have learned back then, relying on myself and knowing when to walk away, even from people who are supposed to care. When I finally finished college, I knew it was time to take a closer look at the properties my dad left me. The whole time I was with my grandparents, I kept reminding myself that these properties were my shot at building something for myself. My dad, he'd planned everything so that I'd have a future even without him around, and I wasn't going to let that go to waste. One of the places my dad left me was the house my mom and Rob were living in. Yeah, the same one where I used to live before everything went down. It was a good house, solid structure, nice neighborhood, perfect for renting out if I ever got the chance. So with my degree in hand and the idea of maybe going for a master's on the horizon, I thought, why not renovate it and rent it out? I mean, extra income wouldn't hurt, especially if I was planning on going back to school. I knew I had to break the news to my mom at some point, and I didn't expect it to go well, but it had to be done. I showed up at the house, one day, ready to have the conversation. The plan was simple. I'd tell her about my intention to renovate and give them a reasonable time frame to figure out their next steps. It was going to be tough, no doubt, but I figured if I was respectful about it, she might understand. Well, that plan didn't even get a chance. When I knocked on the door, no one answered. The house was dead quiet, and their car wasn't in the driveway. I thought maybe they were just out running errands, so I waited for a bit. But after a while, it was clear they weren't coming back anytime soon. I tried calling my mom's cell, left a voicemail, and even sent her a text saying I'd stopped by and wanted to talk. No response. So I headed back to my grandparents' place. Later that night, I found out they were on vacation. My grandma mentioned it casually, like, "Oh, your mom and Rob went down to Florida for a few days." I was like, seriously? Here I am trying to have a mature conversation about my property, and they're off on some beach getaway? I mean, I get that people need a break, but a heads up would have been nice. I gave it a couple more days, hoping she'd get back to me, but still nothing. No call, no text, just radio silence. It was frustrating. I felt like she was avoiding me, and that made things harder. I needed to move forward, but I couldn't do that if she kept dodging me. So after waiting around for a bit, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I knew legally the house was mine. My name was on the deed, and I was the one paying the property taxes every year. So I had the right to take control of the situation. I decided to change the locks. Yeah, I know it sounds drastic, but it felt like the only way to make it clear that I was serious. I needed to start the renovation process, and I couldn't have them treating it like a vacation home while I was trying to move forward with my plans. So I went ahead and did it. I called a locksmith, got the locks changed, and made sure I had all the keys. While I was there, I took a look around the place. It was weird being back in the house where I grew up, but it felt different. It didn't feel like my home anymore. It felt like a stranger's place, with bits and pieces of my mom and Rob's life scattered around. Seeing it like that only made me more determined to follow through with my plan. The next day, my phone started blowing up. My mom had finally gotten back, and she was furious. I had a bunch of missed calls and angry voicemails from her, basically demanding to know why they couldn't get in. She said stuff like, "How could you do this to us?" And, "This is so disrespectful." I could feel the anger just pouring through the phone. I knew she'd be upset, but hearing her like that, it hit harder than I thought. I finally picked up when she called again, and she was shouting before I could even say hello. She was like, "Why did you lock us out of the house?" I tried to stay calm and told her that I'd been trying to reach her for days to talk about my plans. She didn't want to hear it. She kept saying things like, "You can't just kick us out like this, and we have nowhere else to go right now." I explained that I'd given them plenty of time and I had every right to reclaim the house. I told her I planned to renovate and that I'd given her a heads up, but she wasn't having any of it. She said, "This is still my home. You can't just take it away from me." And that's when I knew there was no reasoning with her. In her head, it wasn't about what was legal or fair. It was about what she thought she deserved. At that point, I had to put my foot down. I told her they had 2 weeks to find somewhere else to live. I wasn't going to be a jerk about it. I wanted to give them a chance to move their stuff and figure things out. But 2 weeks was all I could offer. I told her that after that, the renovation work would begin, and they couldn't stay. The silence on the other end of the line was almost worse than the shouting. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and cold. She said, "I never thought you'd do this to your own mother." And I felt that like a punch to the gut. But I knew if I backed down now, I'd never be able to move forward. This was about me taking control of my own life, and sometimes that means making tough calls. After that, I didn't hear from her for the rest of the day. But the next morning, I showed up at the house to start preparing for the renovations, and guess who was waiting for me in the driveway? My mom and Rob, both of them looking furious. Rob tried to step up to me like he was going to intimidate me into letting them stay. He was all, "You think you can just kick us out like this? You've got no right." I didn't back down. I told him flat out, "This isn't your house, and it never was. I'm the one paying for it, and I'm the one calling the shots." He was fuming, but he couldn't argue with that. My mom, though, she started crying, saying I was being unfair, that I was putting them on the street. She said I was acting just like my father, and not in a nice way. It stung, but I kept my cool. I tried to be reasonable and said, "Look, you have 2 weeks to figure things out. I'm giving you that time, but I need to start the renovation soon. This is my property, and I'm doing what's best for me." She just shook her head, tears streaming down her face, saying she couldn't believe how cold I was being. Rob was standing there, trying to look tough, but I could tell he knew he had no power in this. It wasn't easy seeing my mom cry, seeing how angry she was. It sucked. I felt guilty, even though I knew I was doing what I had to do. But I also knew that if I let them stay, I'd never get them out. This was my chance to take back what was mine, and I wasn't going to let it slip through my fingers. By the time they left, it felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. But at the same time, there was this knot in my chest. I knew I'd made the right call, but that didn't make it any less painful. I drove back to my grandparents' place, knowing I'd have to see this through, no matter how hard it got. I thought maybe things would calm down a bit. I figured they'd be mad at first, but then they'd start packing and just accept it. I mean, it wasn't like they had any other option. But of course, nothing is ever that simple. Instead of dealing with it quietly, my mom decided to make things as dramatic as possible. The next day, I went over to the house to start preparing for the renovations. I wanted to check out the backyard and take some measurements for the work I had planned. I had a contractor scheduled to come by in a few weeks, and I wanted to make sure everything was good to go. I was out there with a notepad, making notes, when I heard the back gate swing open. I turned around and there was my mom, storming in like she was on a mission. She was furious. Like, I'm talking full-on yelling before I even had a chance to say anything. "How could you do this to us?" she shouted, her face all red and puffy. She kept going, throwing her hands in the air and demanding to know how I could betray my own family. She was like, "We have nowhere else to go. What do you expect us to do?" I tried to stay calm, even though my heart was pounding. I told her, "Mom, I gave you 2 weeks. You have time to find a new place. I'm not just kicking you out with no warning." But she wasn't hearing it. She went on and on about how I was being selfish and how she had sacrificed so much for me. And honestly, that got to me. It was like she was trying to make me feel guilty for wanting my own space back. And then, of course, Rob showed up. He came in with that same tough guy attitude, like he was going to somehow change my mind by glaring at me. He was all, "You think you can just boss us around because you own this place? We've built a life here." And I was like, "No, Rob, I built a life here. This was my dad's house, and I'm taking back what's mine." I could tell that wasn't what he wanted to hear. He got all worked up, and for a second, I thought he was going to try something. But my mom stepped in, putting her hand on his chest, telling him to calm down. She turned back to me with tears in her eyes and said, "Please, we need more time. We've got nowhere else to go." And then Rob's stepdaughter, the one who's 19, came out of the house crying. I hadn't even noticed her until she stepped onto the porch, clutching her stomach. That's when my mom blurted out, "She's pregnant. You can't do this to her. You can't kick us out when she's about to have a grandchild." That hit me like a punch. I wasn't expecting that. For a moment, I just stood there, not really knowing what to say. It felt like they were pulling out every card they could to get me to change my mind. And I mean, yeah, I felt bad for her. She was young, and being pregnant is a lot to handle. But at the same time, I knew I couldn't let that change things. I took a deep breath and told them, "Look, I'm sorry she's going through that, but this is still my house. You have 2 weeks. I'm not asking you to leave today." My mom started sobbing, and Rob just stood there, looking like he was ready to explode. It got to a point where I just couldn't stand being there anymore. I told them, I've made my decision. I need this place back. I'll come by in 2 weeks to check in. And then I walked out. It wasn't easy. I could hear my mom still yelling as I left, calling me heartless and selfish, and saying she couldn't believe her own son would do this to her. But I had to keep walking. If I stayed there any longer, I knew I'd start second-guessing myself, and I couldn't afford to do that. When I got back to my grandparents' place, I tried to focus on my plans for the renovations. I pulled up all the paperwork, went over my notes, and tried to keep my head clear. But it was hard. I kept thinking about my mom and what she'd said. The guilt started creeping in. I mean, no one wants to be the bad guy, especially not when it comes to family. And then my phone started buzzing. It was one of my mom's relatives, an aunt I barely ever talked to. She was all like, I heard what happened, and I just have to say I'm disappointed in you. Your mom's in a tough spot, and you're making it worse. She kept going on about how I was being cruel and how I needed to help my mom out because that's what family does. It wasn't just her either. Over the next few days, I started getting calls and texts from other relatives, all saying the same thing. They were calling me selfish, saying I should give my mom more time, or even just let her stay. They acted like I was some villain in all this, like I was kicking her out for fun or something. No one seemed to get that this was about my future too. At one point, my grandma noticed how stressed I was getting. She sat me down and said, Listen, you did what you had to do. Don't let them guilt trip you into thinking you're wrong. Your dad left you this house for a reason. And that helped a little. It was good to have her on my side, but it didn't make the phone calls and messages any less annoying. The worst part was when one of my mom's relatives sent me this long message about how my mom was caught in the middle and that I needed to show compassion because she was trying to keep the peace. That one got under my skin. I wanted to reply and say, how is she caught in the middle when she's the one who chose them over me? But I didn't. I knew getting into it with them wouldn't help. It would just add fuel to the fire. So I started ignoring the calls and messages. I figured if they were so worried about my mom, they could help her out. They could offer her a place to stay or pitch in to find her a new spot. But none of them were doing that. It was easier for them to just blame me. Typical. As the days went by, I focused on my renovation plans. I met with the contractor, went over the details, and set up a timeline. I knew once I got things going, I'd have to face my mom and Rob again, and I wasn't looking forward to it. But I kept reminding myself that this was for me, for my future. I'd spent too long letting other people dictate what I could and couldn't do. It was time I took control. And honestly, despite all the drama, I started feeling a bit better about my decision. I knew deep down that I was doing what my dad would have wanted. He left me these properties so I could have a future, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me. Not even my own mom. By the end of that first week, I'd stopped feeling as guilty. I knew I wasn't the one in the wrong here. I'd given them time, and I was being fair. If my mom and Rob wanted to make it harder than it needed to be, that was on them. I just had to stay strong and stick to my plan. By the time the 2 weeks were up, I knew I had to face them again. I spent those days preparing myself mentally, going over what I was going to say when the time came. Part of me hoped Thea had found somewhere else by then and would just quietly move out. But I knew that was probably too much to ask for. The way things had been going, I had a feeling they were going to push back, try to make it as difficult as possible. The day I went back to the house, I pulled up to the driveway, and sure enough, there was my mom, Rob, and even a few of their friends and relatives standing around. It was like they were putting on a show or something. My stomach dropped, but I knew I had to stay calm. If I let them see me stressed, they'd just use that to push me more. As I walked up, my mom came rushing over, tears streaming down her face. She went straight into this whole emotional speech, saying, I can't believe you'd really do this to us. You're my son. How could you turn your back on me when I need you the most? It was the kind of thing that, if I hadn't been so prepared for it, would have really gotten to me. But I'd spent days thinking about it, replaying her words in my head, so I just stayed calm. I told her, Mom, I gave you 2 weeks. That's fair, and you know it. This is my house, and I have every right to take it back. She kept shaking her head, saying I was being unreasonable, and that 2 weeks wasn't enough time. But I knew that wasn't true. If they'd really tried, they could have found something, or at least made some progress. It felt like they were just stalling, hoping that if they pushed hard enough, I'd back down. Then Rob jumped in, all fired up like he was ready for a fight. He was like, this is our home. You can't just show up and take it from us like this. I could feel the tension rising, but I kept my voice steady and said, actually, I can. Legally, it's my property. I've been more than patient, and now it's time for you to move out. I could see the anger in his eyes, but he didn't have a response to that. He knew I was right. That's when the relatives got involved. One of my mom's cousins stepped forward and started going off about how family is supposed to stick together and how I was acting like a landlord instead of a son. She said stuff like, your mom has done so much for you, and now you're just abandoning her. It felt like everyone was ganging up on me, trying to make me feel like the worst person in the world. I took a deep breath and told her, I understand you're trying to help, but this isn't your business. My dad left me this house for a reason, and I'm doing what I have to do. I could tell that didn't go over well because she just scoffed and turned away, muttering something about how I was heartless. At that point, I realized this wasn't going to be a quick conversation. They were all just waiting for me to crack, hoping I'd feel bad enough to change my mind. But I knew if I gave in now, they'd never leave. It would just be more excuses, more drama, and more pressure. I had to stand my ground no matter how bad it felt. My mom started crying even harder, saying things like, I don't know where we'll go. We have no money saved up for this. I had to bite my tongue to stop myself from saying what I was really thinking, which was, maybe you should have thought of that before letting this go on for so long. But I knew that wouldn't help. Instead, I just said, I'm sorry, but I need this space back. You have to find another option. She switched tactics then, asking if she could have a little more time. Just one more month, she said, her voice all shaky. We'll definitely find something by then. I almost felt myself wavering for a second, but then I remembered how she'd used that same tone before. It was always about getting more time, more leeway, but nothing ever really changed. If I gave her another month, I'd be in the exact same spot when that time ran out. So I told her, I've already given you the time I could. I can't wait any longer. Rob, of course, started ranting again about how I was kicking them out with nowhere to go, but I just kept repeating myself. This is my house. I'm taking it back, over and over, like a broken record, because I knew they were trying to wear me down. Then Rob's stepdaughter, the one who's pregnant, came out onto the porch holding her stomach and looking like she was about to burst into tears. She said, please, we don't have anywhere to go. I'm about to have a baby. We need a roof over our heads. Man, that one was rough. It's hard not to feel something when you see a scared, pregnant teenager begging you for help. But I reminded myself that it wasn't my responsibility. It sucked, but I had to focus on what was best for me. I said, I'm really sorry, but I've given as much time as I can. I hope you find somewhere soon. And with that, I turned and walked away. My mom called after me, screaming about how she'd never forgive me for this, but I kept walking. I knew if I stopped, if I turned around and saw her face again, I'd start to doubt myself. When I got back to my car, I felt this mix of emotions. Part of me felt relieved, like I'd finally taken control and made the decision I needed to. But another part of me felt like absolute garbage. It's one thing to tell yourself you're doing the right thing, but it's a whole other thing to feel it when everyone around you is saying you're wrong. I sat in my car for a while, just trying to breathe and not let everything sink in too much. I knew they were angry, and I knew they were probably talking behind my back, but I had to keep telling myself that I was doing what I needed to for my future. My dad left me these properties for a reason, and I wasn't going to let guilt and pressure ruin that. When I finally drove off, I felt a bit lighter. It wasn't easy, and I knew there'd be more backlash to come, but I'd taken the first step. I'd stood my ground, and now it was up to them to figure things out. I wasn't going to let them drag me down with their problems. I had plans, and I was going to stick to them, no matter how many people tried to guilt-trip me. The rest of the day, I focused on my renovation plans. I set up meetings with the contractor, went over the designs, and started getting things in motion. It felt good, like I was finally moving forward with my life. Yeah, there was still that weight of everything that happened, but I knew I'd done the right thing. I wasn't going to let anyone tell me otherwise.